Alright, welcome back to another web development video where I'll show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, we're going to continue our series on web development basics in Webflow. And in this video, I'm going to show you about the CSS box model and how we can manipulate that box model in the Webflow program in the interface. This is one of those things that if you don't get it, it's going to be really difficult for you to understand what's going on and how to manipulate and create layouts in CSS. So it's really a foundational concept to laying out websites and dealing with the physical layout and the connection, the relationships between all of the different elements on the page. So I'm going to continue in our example that we've been using. And I'm going to take this main section right here. You can see that this is main, and it's got our tag of main. And I've added a couple of different elements to it. So our main section still has a very tall self, and then inside of this section there's a heading. I put a paragraph, and I also have a button. So I have a few different elements in here, and the first thing to know about the CSS box model and web design and HTML in general is almost all elements, not every element, but most elements go full width from one side of the viewport to the other, or one side of the body to the other. There are some elements like this button right here, which are called inline or inline block elements, and what if you put a bunch of those right next to each other in the code. So if we add another button and we put it right next to it, those actually line up next to each other. So that's one way that we can create a horizontal relationship between two different elements. We have a lot of other layout tools as well where we don't have to, you have to kind of sacrifice some things in order to get this to happen with these two elements right now. But there are other things that we can use, like CSS Grid or Flexbox, in order to create this relationship horizontally or vertically, but not sacrifice the fact that they would be fully display block, which is what these elements are, where they go all the way across the page. And when they're display block, which is what it sounds like, it's a block all the way across the body. When you have that display block, then you have some other advantages as far as being able to lay out things that we're going to talk about for the border, the margin, and the padding of each element. So you sacrifice that a little bit by having inline elements, but we can manipulate those as they come along. So right now we're just focused on the basics, and we have this main container. You can see it's a big box. Inside of that we have this heading section, we have this paragraph, and this button. And what I want to do is I want to show you just with the background here. Oh, that's the wrong element. We want to be on our main, and we want to change the background just a little bit, just so we can see. So this is our main section here, not the button, but the main. And the main section is a big block. And if you went down here to the sidebar section, you would also see the sidebar is a big block. Okay, so that's what these are. And anytime you have a div or any of these tags here, these are all block level elements. That's what we call them, block level elements. So that means they all behave the same. They behave with a display block, and so they go all the way across the page. They are actually elastic. So if I have an expressed height of 50 viewport heights, but if I take that off, then you can see that the container is only as tall as the content that's inside of it. So it's sort of an important concept as well. If you don't tell the browser what height to make an element, then it will make it whatever height the things inside of it are. So you can manipulate that height by using margin and padding and things like that we're going to show you. But also you can give it an expressed height in different types of units. So over here we can use pixels, which is a very defined unit on the page, a percentage of the viewport. You can use an M, which is sort of an elastic type of element. You can also use rems, but that's attached to whatever the size on the body is. You can use, you can make it the height determined on the viewport width, or you can make it determined on the viewport height. So before we were using 50 viewport heights, which is like saying 50% of the viewport height. So it calculates the viewport height from top to bottom. So a phone is taller than it is wide, right? So you're calculating the top to the bottom of the viewport, which is this part here. So just where all the dark area is, that's the viewport, not all of this chrome and stuff up here. That's part of the window. So the viewport is only taking into account the part of the website that you can view. And then there's auto, and the default for these is a height of auto, so it sort of like a rubber band. It'll move up and down depending on the size of the content inside of the container. So let me go ahead and put a color on this as well. This is our sidebar section. So that sidebar is definitely different. We have some margin on this particular element by default. Some of these elements have margin and padding by default. So like when you create a paragraph and with a p tag, there's a margin on the top and the bottom to simulate what you would do with putting a space between paragraphs. So it comes with some margin automatically built into it. Also something important to remember when you're trying to figure out why things aren't lining up the way you want, because each element comes sort of with its own line height and margin and things like that. You should be able to build an HTML website with proper spacing without having to add any CSS. Now we use CSS to create more complex layouts, but if you just laid out a page, it should look okay, like a term paper whenever we've written it. Okay, so we see these two things are right next to each other, but they're two different, there's main and then there's sidebar. You can see these. So you can see over here how they are highlighted. So there's main here and then sidebar, right? If we come over to our main section, and most of the things that we're going to deal with the box model are in the spacing section in the UI for Webflow. There's also some things down here with the borders. So there's a couple different sections that we're dealing with the box model, but most of everything that you're going to deal with is here in the layout or the spacing. So inside we have padding, and we can adjust that padding. Outside we have the margin, and you can see that this looks similar to a box, right? And you can imagine this is the content and then there's padding, and this is the outside or the border of the element, and then this is the margin. So margin goes outside the border of the element. You can think of it like space between two things on a table. So you have two cups sitting next to each other on a table, and as you move those things apart, you're creating space between them. That space between those two things is the margin. So there's actual outside space between two objects. So you can see it in action here. If we create margin on the top, then we've created margin between this masthead element, which ends here, and this element here. If we take that away and we put margin on the bottom, you can see with the arrow here that how far away it is. So I'm just clicking and dragging up and down. Left and right doesn't do anything for these. So for the vertical margin, that's what we're doing. So you can create as much margin between these two things. And you can see here that this color is actually the background color for the entire body of the website. So if we go to our body, and the background of the website is, let's say, some sort of a faint pink. Now you can see that this section up here doesn't have a background color, but this one does have an expressed background color. And this one has an expressed background color, and there's space in between these two things, between these two boxes. So if we come up and you can also click on these, and then it gives you some more options. You don't have to just drag. So you can drag it here and pull it all the way down. You can click on these predetermined sizes here. You can do auto. You can reset it back to its original or initial value. And so that's what we'll do. It goes back to the way it was when we before we made any changes. So now we're back. This up here has the background color. This is all clear, transparent, so we don't see anything but the background color of the base, the bottom of the website. This one has its own color, this has its own color, and this has no color, right? The footer. It's transparent, and it takes up the background of the website. Now if we come back to our main section and we look instead at padding, when we create padding, it also does the same thing. You can see how it's doing this. Oh, sorry, it's doing that because it's margin. So if we come to the padding and we add padding as well, so you can see that we wind up with a space between this gray, dark gray, and our text and our button. But what's happened, we don't see the background anymore, because what happened is there's no space still between these two items, between our main and our sidebar. There's no actual margin between them. They're still butted up against each other. But what we've done is inside of main, we've created space. So you can see, let's see, when you roll over, you can see that the green is inside of this light gray area. And when I roll over the margin, there's nothing outside. But if I were to do the margin and roll over the margin, you can see that this blue color indicates that there's space in between these two boxes. So when we see the green, we know that that is padding. So this is Webflow's way of showing you where the padding is in the object. And this is actually a very helpful visual aid inside of Webflow to help you know where is the margin, where's the padding, and what do I need to adjust in order to change those values. Padding can also be done on the edges. So same thing. And you see how this box remains gray, but even our text is being shortened up. You see our text is being shortened up. And that's because inside this box, you can see that this green space is space that's not taken up by the content. It's being sort of squished. I don't know a better way to explain it, but it's sort of like filling in the middle of a box with something. And so if you fill in the middle, it sort of squeezes everything to whatever side that you're filling the box with. And again, we can come and reset these values. Maybe there's a way to reset them all. I don't know. If we want to do multiple values, let's say we want margin on, between this logo section and the sidebar. We want space on both sides, and we want it to be equal. Then we hold down the Alt key. Is that right? No. It's the, yeah, Alt. So we hold down the Alt key, and you can just move your cursor as far as you need to. So now you can see that we have an equal amount, 82 pixels on the top and 82 pixels on the bottom. So you keep like consistent spacing. You can do the same thing on the edges. draw it in this, well, that's not right. Okay, draw it this way. I'm holding down the Alt key, and it's bringing it in on the edges at the same amount. So there's the same amount of space on this side as this side, so 179 pixels. So you can see here that we have this much space on the sides and this much on the top and bottom, and you can actually get a visual picture of how the element is being moved around the page. And what this does is it takes our gray background and it sort of separates it from all of the other elements, and so now we can see the body color underneath. Let's say you wanted this look where everything is sort of pushed to the middle, but you don't want to get rid of the gray. You want all this to still be gray. What you would do is come and you would use the padding instead. So if we come in, remember the padding is inside the element, the spacing inside the element, and then you can take the padding from the top and bottom as well. And then now we keep the gray color that's inside the box. Still no separation between these two elements, but we also create separation from the border from the inside to the middle. And that's what padding does. So padding gives you separation from the border, which is the outside edge of the element, to the inside content. If you want to create space between, from border to border of elements, then you would use the margin. That's not the better one. Let's do this one. So then you would use the margin to create space from one border of an element to another border. But again, that opens up the ability to see whatever's underneath those elements. Okay, and what about the elements inside? We can keep this main element elastic, and then we can control spacing with just these elements here. So I've clicked on the main. This is heading 2, and we'll call it main heading, and just so that we don't mess up all these other H2 elements. And we can come in and we can create margin as well, and we can create and now margin is being created between this element here and this element here, because this top level element sort of affects the top level of its parent element. So we clearly changed everything on the heading, not the main, but it had the same effect as if we had put margin on the main. Now if we go back and we click on this element here and we do margin on this element, now you can see we're creating margin only between this element and the header. So we're only creating margin right here. We're not creating it with this section up here. So this has a sort of a special function because it's right up to the edge of the box. If this has margin, then it pushes everything down. If you wanted that same thing to happen, you wanted top space here, but you didn't want a space between these two, between the logo and the main body element, then you would use padding. You can see how we keep the gray, and we still have our space, but now our H2 element goes from here all the way to the very top. So we haven't created any margin. But you can see that creating margin still applies because our element is at the very top of this element. So when we want to manipulate things, we want to use padding, and we want to use margin. And these are our main tools for that. You can also use borders. Let's say our border is 5 pixels wide. Okay, so that puts a border of 5 pixels all the way around our element. And let's see, that's inline block. What happens is this block of text is a P tag, and a P tag is a block level element. So it goes all the way across the page, and that's its domain. It goes 100% across the page unless you tell it be shorter or be longer, I guess. Actually, it goes 100% of whatever the containing element is. In this sense, it's the body of the website. As soon as we turn it into an inline element, just like this button was an inline block element, as soon as we turn it into inline, that means it's sort of up next to each other. It's not one big box, it's sort of like multiple boxes. And it takes away that sense of it being one whole, and sort of breaks it up and makes sure that everything is in line with itself. But if we come back, you can see that now the border is all the way across. It keeps the space between here because it's only looking at from here around. It's not looking necessarily at the actual text itself. It's looking at the box around the text. Now this one is called Inline Block, which is interesting because it behaves like an inline element, but it also retains some of the good parts of being a block level element. So it doesn't necessarily have to come up inline, but if it's next to an inline element, it will sit next to one. But we can also still manipulate its box properties with margin and padding. If this were strictly an inline element like this, which is what most links are, like an A-link, whenever you make one, A-links are inline elements, and you can see that they don't sort of take up their own space, and we don't have access anymore to their margin properties. So there's a it's given us margin in between, so left and right, but it's not allowing us to separate it between two different elements like that. So as soon as you make it a block level element, then we get access to all of the margin and the padding, and as well as the borders. We can apply the borders as well. So depending on how you want the elements to relate or interact with one another, you would use padding or you would use margin, realizing that if you want space inside an element and you want the background to sort of stay there and you don't want the background to be separated from the other elements, then you would use padding. If you want the elements to be separated from one another, then you would use margin to separate those elements from one another. There are some advantages and disadvantages of using each of those things, and not really getting into strategy too much in this video, but just wanted to show you the box model and then how that applies here inside of Webflow. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you haven't subscribed, please click the subscribe button, and if you click the bell notification, you'll be notified whenever I post new videos. If you haven't seen the other videos in this particular playlist, go back and see them. That's in the description. And we cover things like semantic HTML tags and CSS classes and some other different things. The goal is to help you translate web development, what people might do by hand, translate that into the graphic interface for Webflow, to help you make better websites and to understand what's going on in Webflow, because it's not a drag and drop editor. Webflow is sort of a graphic layer over the top of code that's actually being written underneath. You could just as easily write what I just did with HTML and CSS code, but instead we're using a graphic interface to make it a little bit easier to visually design and code. So you can think of it as like visual coding. But it's still important to understand the underlying web development concepts, because you're going to be a little bit lost if you don't know how to build a website already. So that's sort of the gap I'm trying to fill. If you want to connect with me on Twitter, I'm at Brian Hafferkamp, and if you want to help pay this forward, just click the thumbs up button. That's really all it takes, and that's super helpful for the videos. All right, I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.